All right, so welcome to my first distance learning lecture. Now, I already posted a lot of the relevant information on Edmodo with regards to, why I'm making these lectures, what you need to do with them, are they required, that kind of stuff. So please go ahead and check that information out if you haven't already, and don't be afraid to ask me any questions you might have regarding these lectures or the information contained within them. So without further ado, going to get into this here. The Soviet Afghan War, by the way, we did start discussing that towards the end of school, before everything was canceled the rest of the semester, but that was 5 weeks ago, and I figure it wouldn't hurt to go back and just recover all the background information one more time, and it'll give you more to write for your notes. So anyway, here we go. So 2 critical factors to keep in mind when discussing the Soviet Afghan War, first of all, is U.S. containment policy. Now, you guys, I'm pretty sure you're familiar with what this is by now, but just as a quick refresher, containment policy was the U.S. policy of we need to keep communism from spreading any further. And during the Cold War, this was one of, if not the main motivator behind our actions and the moves that we made during that time, particularly with the proxy wars we fought in Korea and Vietnam. And we're going to see this come into play again in a more indirect way, but still come into play again during the Soviet Afghan War. Now, secondly, in the years leading up to the Soviet Afghan War, you had a huge turnover rate in the government of Afghanistan. It changed hands several times, and along with it, the policies changed. And increasingly, as time went on, these policies became more and more communist in nature. And so people responded to this with a lot of backlash, a lot of disagreement and revolt, and this eventually led to infighting, and this culminated in the Soviet Union deciding to invade Afghanistan, thus sparking the Soviet Afghan War. Now, if you look at the picture on the right, you'll see 6 countries on there under Uncle Sam's nose there, and you'll see us there on the far right, the U.S., and then towards the center, you'll see Pakistan. And it's actually the relationship between those 2 countries that I want to start off with next, and you'll see why shortly. Now, the U.S. had previous diplomatic relations or foreign policy within the Middle East before World War II. But this really started taking off after World War II with the advent of the United Nations and us just taking bigger and bigger steps onto the world stage like we never have before, and taking part more and more with the affairs of other countries. And after World War II, one of the first big steps we made into increasing our role in the Middle East was with Pakistan. Now, Pakistan became an independent nation in 1947. And that same year, we began diplomatic relations with them. And now the main reason behind this, or at least one of the main reasons, was we saw this as an opportunity to help contain the spread of communism within Asia. Now, how does that work? If you look at the map on the right, you'll see, East and West Pakistan. I'll get to why there's an East and West Pakistan in a minute. But the countries that are just north of what's shown on the map were largely already part of the Soviet Union. And in fact, China, which is on the map, fell to communism 2 years later in 1949. And so Pakistan, we saw that as, giving us a second base of operations that was much closer to where this spread of communism was threatening to take place. And so that's the main reason why we started with them. And it was also an opportunity for Pakistan to receive help, them being a country that had just gained their independence, to gain help from what was quickly becoming one of the most powerful nations in the world. As far as East and West Pakistan goes, this was what it originally was when it gained its independence. Both of them were considered just Pakistan. And the East and West was just to differentiate between which landmass you were talking about, because there were differences in the demographics of the people in each of them. But East Pakistan doesn't exist anymore. It became Bangladesh in 1971, and it's been like that for 50 years. But anyway, that's where we started with Pakistan, and our next Next big move in the 1950s was to sign the Mutual Defense Assistance Agreement with Pakistan. And that's pretty self-explanatory with the title. You know, one of the countries gets attacked or something bad happens to them, the other country will come to the aid of the other. And as far as SEATO goes, the Southeast Asian Treaty Organization, that ceased to be even before the Soviet Afghan War started, but both Pakistan and the U.S. joined this organization sometime later after joining forces with each other. And what happened here was all the countries that were members of that had the common goal, among other things, of uniting to help prevent the spread of communism in Asia. Now, even though we had established diplomatic relationships with Pakistan, some stuff got mixed up in the 1960s and 1970s. Now, this mainly revolved around during the two wars that Pakistan fought with India, 1965 and 1971, the U.S. had placed embargoes on military supplies that would have been sent to Pakistan otherwise. Now, this was because we disagreed with, first of all, in 1965, we disagreed with the war itself that they had with India. And in 1971, which just so happened to be the start of the second war they had with them, there were some human rights violations going on in East Pakistan that the U.S. was not okay with. And so, as a way to motivate or coerce Pakistan into changing their policies and thus their actions, we put these embargoes in place. Despite this, and despite the tensions that were created by putting these embargoes in place, our relationship with Pakistan continued, and it would become even more crucial during the Soviet Afghan War, particularly since Afghanistan and West Pakistan share a border. Now, to move forward, the background of politics in Afghanistan. Now, in the 1920s, the family of Mohammad Zahir Shah had helped to re-centralize the government's power in that country. And in 1933, Zahir Shah became the king of Afghanistan. And this would be the start of a monarchical system of government that would last about 40 years. And within that time, his cousin, Mohammad Daoud Khan, became the prime minister of Afghanistan. Now, during his tenure, some important stuff happens. First, he does help to push for certain progressive policies, such as more rights for women and trying to modernize the country. And he even succeeded in helping improve living conditions for the people of Afghanistan during this time. However, some of his foreign policy, particularly with regards to Pakistan, proved to be controversial. And some of these policies were becoming detrimental to the way Afghanistan was functioning. So in 1963, 10 years after he assumed his role as prime minister, Zahir Shah forced his cousin to resign from that position. And the next year set up a constitutional monarchy. And one of the key policies under this constitutional monarchy was that the family members of the current king could not hold any political office, which, as you can figure out, was a major block to Daoud Khan coming back into political power and trying to re-implement his policies. But as history has shown so often, there's a way around this. And in 1973, while Zahir Shah was off in another country on other business, Daoud Khan seized power, took over the throne, and replaced the monarchy with a republic. Now, Zahir Shah, as I said, he was out of the country. He did not get killed during this, and in fact lived until 2007. So he actually lived well past the end of the Soviet Afghan War. But unlike Zahir Shah himself, the monarchy was very much dead, and we are now at the Republic of Afghanistan. Now that is Daoud Khan on the right there in that picture. And before going into his policies on in his current role that he had, it's important to go over one more thing. Now, during his role as prime minister under the monarchy of Afghanistan, he had started to develop relations between the Afghan government and the Soviet Union. It's not like what we'll see later on, but there were still some dependencies going on there, and he looked to them for certain types of aid. But when he set himself up as president and prime minister of his new republic, he began to try to stave off the dependency that the Afghan government had developed with the Soviet Union. And there were, at the time, in the country, including, and this includes some people who were already in political positions, there were those who sympathized with communist ideologies. And they did not like the fact that Khan was trying to pull away from the Soviet Union and the relationship the Afghan government had with them. So people tried to protest his rule, and he responded by trying to take away the civil rights of those people. Kind of ironic considering earlier, during his tenure as prime minister under the monarchy of Afghanistan, he tried to push for progressive rights. Now, all this discontent culminated in what's known as the Tsar Revolution, 1978 in April. And among other things that happened, Daud Khan was overthrown and he was killed. Now, I had just mentioned in the past couple minutes that there were some people in Afghanistan who sympathized with communist ideologies. Now, one of these groups was founded in the 60s. They split into two parties, and one of those parties had actually helped Khan to overthrow or to seize power from his cousin back in 1973. But due to the changing policies of Khan and the discontent, these two rival parties united back as one, and they overtook Daud Khan and killed him. And this party is known as the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, or PDPA, and that is their emblem right there that you see. Now, two key people come into play here. Initially, it was ruled by Nur Muhammad Taraki, who functioned as the president, and then Hafizullah Amin was the prime minister. Now, between the two of these people, Hafizullah Amin had the more extreme policies, and these provoked revolt. In particular, he had tried to put into place land reforms. Now, this is such a huge issue because Afghanistan at the time was, the population was made up of 90% rural people. In other words, people living out in the country, a lot of them had farmland, and that was their livelihood. And even today, around 75% of the population is still rural. So this was a big deal for most of the population, and his land reforms, among other things, tried to cap the maximum amount of land that people were allowed to own, which was restrictive in and of itself. But also, in true communist fashion, he tried to set up to where land could be redistributed forcibly to peasants. And most of the population, for what should be obvious reasons, did not like this. It was threatening to upset their way of life, and so they started to revolt. And Amin's response to this was the imprisonment and the execution of a lot of these people, and this resulted in, this totaled up to tens of thousands of deaths. Now, that same year, the Afghan government and the Soviet Union signed a friendship treaty, so they're starting to get closer. And this had two purposes. One, the first purpose was not unlike what one of the goals was behind the Mutual Defense Assistance Agreement we signed with Pakistan back in the 50s. And this was to look out for each other, watch each other's back, and if one of the two countries is in danger, the other would come to help. The second goal was to try to quell all these uprisings that were occurring, with all the discontent at the policies of this nearly communist government that was in place at the present time. Now, this second goal was unsuccessful, and in 1979, more riots began to break out, and Soviet help becomes requested. Now, in the midst of all this, Hafizullah Amin kills Nur Muhammad Taraki and sets himself up as president. Now, the Soviet Union was alarmed by this. They had tried to prevent Taraki from getting killed because, among other reasons, they were skeptical or shaky about Amin's leadership, as well as all the chaos that was ensuing within Afghanistan. Now, obviously, they were not successful in that. And another fear of theirs that they had with the way things were going is that the people of Afghanistan would overthrow the government that existed currently, that the Soviet Union was trying to help keep propped up, and that they would turn Afghanistan into an independent Islamic state. And that beyond this, that the Soviet countries that bordered Afghanistan would then begin to fall from communism and become independent Islamic states themselves, which is a concept not unlike that of the domino theory that was held by people who feared that communism would spread from one country to their neighbors and then to their neighbors and then so on, like a row of dominoes getting knocked over one by one in a sequence. So ultimately, the Soviet Union reacted by invading Afghanistan on Christmas Eve of 1979. And you'll see in the picture here a Soviet tank rolling through the streets in Afghanistan during the invasion, and this appears to have been taken from inside somebody's car. That is not something you see rolling down the street in your car every day. But in any case, we are at the beginning of the Soviet Afghan War. Just to recap, we've seen Afghanistan go from being a monarchy for several decades to changing over to a republic, and then historically speaking, not too long after that, becoming a borderline communist state. And then along with this, the policies had changed, and the discontent of the people had begun to rise along with all of these changes. And this led to the Soviets invading Afghanistan and the start of the war. All right, so now we are at the official beginning of the Soviet Afghan War. And the way this started off was with an airlift on the part of the Soviet Union into Kabul, which is the capital of Afghanistan. Now, this consisted in about 280 aircraft and over 25,000 soldiers. And now they quickly take over local communication lines and major roads, and within about 3 days, they've captured the capital. And in the middle of all this, Hafizullah Amin is killed and replaced by Barbak Karmal, who is another leader from the PDPA, and he becomes the new state leader. Now, in addition to the capital being seized, there are other areas being attacked, and these attacks were carried out using a combination of aerial attacks, like carpet bombing villages, as well as tanks and infantrymen or foot soldiers on the ground. Now, this whole thing was seen as, by the Soviets, was seen as a necessary intervention, to try to prop up the government that, as I mentioned earlier, existed in Afghanistan and had progressively become more and more like the Soviet government and had adopted more and more communist policies over time. Now, the rest of the world, or the rest of the world outside the Soviet Union, did not agree, and this included the very citizens in Afghanistan themselves. You can see a lot of them in that picture here. This picture was taken during the invasion into Afghanistan initially. Now, the citizens of Afghanistan, who we already see had a lot of disagreement with the current government, began to coalesce into various militias, and they became the main opposition to the Soviet efforts, along with the efforts of the Afghan government. And this opposition, collectively, was known as the Mujahideen. Now you see a group of Mujahideen in this picture with their weapons, and Mujahideen were made up of many different groups of people. They were different in their places of origin, sometimes coming from outside of Afghanistan. Their languages, their primary languages, were often different, and their degree of religious devotion was often different. And above all, there were rivalries that were inherent between these groups. Now, the name Mujahideen translates to those engaged in jihad. Jihad meaning holy war, and that's exactly what the Mujahideen called for against the Soviets, hence their name. And so this was actually a pretty smart move on their parts from their point of view for a couple different reasons. One is that now there was a religious motive behind this, and so this gave more reason for other Muslim nations to rally around them and support their cause. And in addition, the Soviet Union, which made up most of their opponents, was inherently very atheistic. And so you have a lot of Muslims, both inside and outside of Afghanistan, seeing all these atheists coming in and trying to upset their way of life and their desire to create an independent Islamic nation. And so all this provided more and more motivation for them to fight against the Soviets. Now, unfortunately for the Mujahideen, they were not as inherently well equipped as the Soviets. And so largely what they had to rely on, in addition to help from other countries, which we'll get to on the next slide, they had to out-strategize their opponents. And this consisted in using guerrilla warfare, which is just hit-and-run tactics where they would pop out, attack for a little bit, and then they would run back and hide. Now, a lot of mountainous terrain exists in Afghanistan, and these people knew their terrain much better than the Soviets, and they used this knowledge and their strategies to outmaneuver their opponents. Now, all this, to me at least, is pretty reminiscent of the situation the American colonists were in towards the beginning of the American Revolution, where you had just a bunch of little local militias and then eventually the Continental Army fighting against this massive empire, the British, who had one of, if not the biggest militaries in the world at that time. And yet the little guys were able to hold their own against the big dogs. And so in a lot of ways, this was the same type of situation. Now, America did get involved in this, and I'll get to that picture in a minute. But first, I want to backtrack and go back to the summer of 1979, where you had what's called Operation Cyclone. Now, this was one of the most expensive covert operations that the CIA ever carried out. This was done under Jimmy Carter during his presidency. And what this consisted in was providing financial assistance to the Mujahideen months before the war even started. Now, this was not a one-time thing. It happened over and over again over the next decade, and the amount increased by the year, with starting off in about in the equivalent of millions of dollars worth of help, and then later growing into hundreds of millions per year in the next decade. In addition, you also have the U.S. supplying various weapons to the Mujahideen. The most key of these being the shoulder-mounted portable missile launcher. And we'll get to this picture here. It's an artist's depiction rather than a photo, but that doesn't mean it's any less effective. You see one of the Mujahideen firing what's called a Stinger out of that. It's a surface-to-air missile, which basically means now the Mujahideen from the ground can attack and successfully take down the opposing side's aircraft, which you see about to happen in that picture. They also were able to plunder weapons from their defeated opponents, and that only added to their arsenal. Now, one other nation that comes into play here that acts as kind of a middleman for us is Pakistan. I mentioned earlier that they became of crucial importance during the Soviet Afghan War, and here's where that shows the most. Now, Pakistan, we would send them the supplies, and then they would act as the distributor and give those out to the Afghan people as they needed them. In addition, as you remember from the map earlier, Afghanistan and Pakistan shared a border. And so a lot of people were fleeing from Afghanistan into Pakistan as refugees, and later on training programs even began in Pakistan for the Afghan people. So they definitely came into play here in a major way. Now, despite all the help that the Mujahideen were receiving from us and from Pakistan, and the support from other countries, really neither side in this conflict was really able to upend the other side. It was becoming a long, drawn-out war, really with no end in sight, and it was a series of stalemates, with advantages not being able to be held for very long by one side over the other. And so, in the mid-'80s, plans began to happen to try to end the war. It started with Mikhail Gorbachev in 1985 becoming the General Secretary of the Soviet Union. And he, among other things, harbored anti-war sentiment and also noticed the severe economic toll that the war was taking on the Soviet Union. Remember, as I've said in the past, war is very expensive, and this was no exception. And so plans in the mid-'80s began to be made for the eventual withdrawal of troops. And in 1988, in Geneva, the Accords on Afghanistan were signed by the United States and the Soviet Union, along with Afghanistan and Pakistan. And not only were plans made for the troops to begin to withdraw from Afghanistan, specifically the Soviet troops, but also for helping to better the relation between Pakistan and Afghanistan and helping them to draw guidelines for one another on how to have a friendly, non-interferent relationship with one another. So Soviet troops began to leave Afghanistan in 1988, and February 1989 is when the last of the soldiers leave. And in that picture, you actually see the last bands of Soviet soldiers leaving it. This was taken on February 15th, 1989. And so what you're seeing here is a vestige of the end of the Soviet Afghan War. Now, the conflicts themselves in Afghanistan did not stop. The Soviets were no longer involved, but stuff kept going on there. But before I get into detail on that aftermath, I'm going to discuss some of the results of this. Both sides suffered significant losses, with the Soviet Union losing about 15,000 soldiers, as well as incurring the equivalent of billions of US dollars in financial hardships and losses. And on the Mujahideen side, they had lost about 90,000 soldiers, and the citizens of Afghanistan, about 1 million of them, had been killed in the process, either through raids or through those who were unlucky enough to be caught in the crossfire during the Soviet Afghan War. Also, meanwhile, in 1991, the Soviet Union falls. Now, there were many contributions to this. These mostly consisted in the policies that Mikhail Gorbachev had begun to put into place, which loosened the hold of the Soviet Union over the Soviet countries in Eastern Europe, which eventually led to them being able to return to their preferred forms of government, as well as elections being able to be held in Russia itself under his leadership. But the financial losses from the Soviet Afghan War were also a likely factor in this. Now, I said earlier that the fighting kept going on in Afghanistan, and this was between the Afghan government and the Mujahideen. Eventually, the government was overthrown, and the Mujahideen were back to their old rivalries, which resulted in a lot of chaos and turmoil in Afghanistan. Now, people got into power, but they weren't able to keep that position due to all these rivalries. And so nothing was stable, and nothing was permanent, and the long-term effects of this were catastrophic. A couple different things came up here that are key. One of the groups that was allowed to come in, that was given room to come into existence and to flourish in the midst of all this chaos, was the Taliban. And secondly, we have a man that gave a lot of financial assistance to the Mujahideen during the Soviet Afghan War, and later became the leader of a group of Islamic extremists known as Al-Qaeda. And of course, if you haven't guessed who I'm talking about yet, his picture's right there. That would be Osama bin Laden. And under his leadership, Al-Qaeda would later go on to commit, among other things, the attacks in New York City on September 11, 2001. So that is the Soviet Afghan War. For those of you who do better with lectures to take notes, I hope this was helpful for you. Don't be afraid to ask any questions, leave any comments. Those of you who are not part of the 2 classes I was teaching the rest of the semester for my student teaching, feel free to leave any constructive criticism below. In the comments, I definitely have more than plenty of room to grow in all this. And so that's it for this one, and I will see you guys next time.